So, just a reminder that the talks are about something very specific. I say this at the beginning of every satsang, and I tend to outline a general framework. And the reason is that the mind has no idea of where it should be looking. It starts off shaped a certain way by life, and then comes across a whole lot of information. And actually, if you are exposed to the broad range of teachings that there are, you could get very confused. Because 1 minute on the Facebook feed, if you see this, it says, recognize that there is nobody here. And then the next feed by some other piece of wisdom is saying, you are very much here. And another one says that, everything is God's will, and something else says you are the one that has to act in life. And so if you listen to different teachings, you could get very confused. And actually the fact that different teachings say sometimes things that sound or even are completely contradictory, often they sound contradictory and they're not actually contradictory. But sometimes teachings are contradictory. It doesn't actually make one of them wrong or both of them wrong. It just means that the teaching is undoing a particular problem that another teaching might not be undoing, or they could be both undoing the same problem but using different methodology. And so it's really important for us to understand that teachings are not truth. The teachings have been telling us this for as long as teachings have been around, because they understand that the problem is the brain that takes things and relative things and treats them absolutely. That's actually the freedom that we come to have, is a freedom from the brain interpreting things absolutely. It's a freedom from an openness to allowing things to essentially be as they are, because we understand that my interpretation of them is only ever going to be that. And a lot of suffering arises because we have an interpretation of who we are and an interpretation of what life is doing to me, whether it's adding or subtracting from who I am. So the teachings have been telling us that they are teachings for thousands of years. In Buddhism, it's one of the phrases that remind us of this. If you see Buddha on the road, kill him. It's saying you have to transcend even the teachings and the teacher. They essentially have to be let go of at the end. And in this framework that's put forward, it's stated very clearly that whatever is said is a concept. Whatever anyone has ever said is a concept. The only truth in the manifestation is the impersonal sense of I am. Now, today I'm starting off with an emphasis on this point. If the emphasis isn't on this point, that statement, which is a very powerful statement, whatever is said is always a concept. Whatever is written down is a concept. And no matter who has said anything about the nature of life, it's always only ever been a concept. No one has ever uttered a word of truth. And so there is a focus in the talks. And the focus is happiness in daily living. Continuous, unbroken happiness in daily living. Why that's the focus is because in practical terms, from my own experience and the experience of my teacher, Ramesh, and when you interpret in between the lines, the experience of many people that are putting forward these teachings, their experience is that continuous happiness in life is available. Actually, the assertion here is that the byproduct or the pinnacle of the search is, in practical terms, happiness in daily living. And frankly, if the pinnacle of the search wasn't something practical and useful, what would the point be? You know, if we came to understand the truth, if there is such a thing as truth, we even, let's say, we understand the workings of the universe, but it didn't deliver anything practical, frankly, I think it would be worth putting your efforts into other endeavors. But it turns out that this transformation actually delivers continuous happiness in daily living, regardless of the circumstance you find yourself in. And what is meant by happiness is important to describe, so that if we're creating a focus, we don't have a focus that one person can interpret one way and the other person interprets it another way. So the word happiness is described as actually peace of mind in daily living. Continuous, unbroken peace of mind, regardless of the circumstance we find ourselves in. This is important because it turns out that the ingrained belief of what happiness for the human being is, before this investigation or inquiry happens, the ingrained belief is that happiness is to be found in outcomes, that happiness is some sort of feeling or something added to our experience, like excitement or pleasure, bliss even. And so Ramesh used to often point out that one of the unfortunate occurrences in spirituality was the translation of Satchit Ananda, and particularly the word Ananda being translated as bliss. And when people with a good understanding of the language and the context in which it was put forward, so I saw an interview once with Ramesh and a physicist who was also a theologian, physicist in India, in Indian, and he said actually the correct translation of Ananda, because it's a transcendental state that is being pointed at, would be much closer to peace than bliss. But maybe there's another reason why it got translated as bliss, because if the seeker actually starts off needing something, a carrot to follow, to chase after, because this deeply ingrained belief that happiness is to be found in outcomes is there. And so if you said you won't get anything, no outcomes from this search, then the motivation for a lot of seeking in its early stages may not be there. But when we start getting specific, it turns out that this happiness that's available is happiness through peace of mind, not the addition of anything, not the addition of some special feeling. And if we want to be more specific about what peace of mind looks like, it's the absence of suffering. So we could say that happiness for the human being is the end of suffering. Happiness for the human being is peace of mind. Peace of mind is the absence of suffering. So happiness is the absence of suffering. Turns out that Buddha has put the condensed version of Buddhism, as I came across it, in 2 sentences. Enlightenment is the end of suffering. The cause of suffering is desire. So you can see that we're approaching it from an angle of keeping it practical, but we're speaking about the same thing. And the suffering that ends arises in the form of guilt, blame, pride, worry and anxiety, expectation and attachment to outcome. And under each of those 5 main headings, there are subsets of suffering. So under guilt, there's insecurity, lack of self-worth, shame. But there's the simple guilt, like the guilt of not giving your neighbor a ride to work when you saw him standing at the bus stop. The guilt of, not helping a friend when they asked. So the range of guilt, the intensity and the different forms varies. Blame can have resentment, hatred, jealousy, blame for the person not topping up the water bottle in the fridge so there's no cold water in the fridge. Once again, a large range of blame. Judgment can fit in under blame. Self-judgment fits in under guilt. Pride is clearly associated with arrogance, sense of superiority, seeing the other as inferior, and often judgment fits in under there. Why are you doing it? Why aren't you able to, get off the sofa and go and earn a living like I do? So there's lots of different forms of suffering. And then there's worry and anxiety, which are self-explanatory. Anxiety is the sense that something has already gone wrong and I'm just waiting to find out what it is. And then expectation and attachment to outcomes are very linked together, but slightly different. And expectation is how we hope and would expect life to turn out because we believe that is what will give us happiness. So expectation is linked to our idea that our happiness is to be found in outcomes. And then attachment to outcome linked to expectation. It's that feeling when an outcome doesn't turn out and there's a resistance against the fact it hasn't turned out. Maybe you miss an aeroplane or a bus, you lose money, and someone that said they're going to come and visit doesn't come and visit. And that resistance on an attitudinal level to the fact that the pleasure you would have liked didn't happen can be called attachment to outcome. So if enlightenment is the end of suffering, it really means enlightenment is the end of the arising of these different forms that I'm speaking of. And it turns out that these forms are all types of thinking, and on a condensed, intense version, it appears as a feeling in the body, not just a thought in the head. But that then lends us to think that feelings in the body actually have a storyline beneath them. We might not know what the storyline is, we just feel uncomfortableness, but actually if you dive into the feeling, you'll find a storyline there about what's happening. So suffering that ends or can end is a type of thinking, and when we look at it, we see that it's a very specific type of thinking, which is always attitudinal, meaning thinking about what has happened in life. So our suffering and it turns out our happiness is attitudinal and not circumstantial. When our attachment to outcomes is really strong, what it means is as soon as the outcome isn't delivered, the attitude of attachment kicks in. And so it can seem like our suffering is actually circumstantial. Because our attitude is always directly related to circumstance. When we look at it more closely, we see the circumstance itself is either pleasure or pain. And the suffering is not the pleasure or pain itself, but it's an additional load on top of the pleasure or pain. So what's suggested in this set of concepts put forward is that enlightenment isn't going to suddenly make circumstance change radically. Life will still be pleasure sometimes and pain at others. So the pain and the pleasure has to be endured and enjoyed. There's no escaping that. And in a way, that's what life is. But the suffering is attitudinal to circumstance. And so what determines our attitude to circumstance? And the answer put forward in this framework is that what determines our attitude is the deeply ingrained beliefs about who we are and what life is. These deeply ingrained beliefs are not something that we conjured up, but as we'll discuss, they're beliefs that life has embedded as the process of growing or experiencing life happens. And so once those beliefs are put in place, they have to flower, they have to explode sometimes into manifestation when circumstance is a particular way. It's not optional. It's mechanical. So the belief about who we are and what life is, on which suffering arises, is a belief that says, I am this physical entity and my completeness is dependent on outcomes. I get added to when the other does things that I like, and I'm subtracted from when the other does things that are not in line with my preferences. So that is a self-image that life has put in place about who I am. And an adjunct to that self-image is the belief that as this entity, I am the controller of everything that I think, that I feel, that I say, and then that I do. And so if I believe myself to be the controller of everything I think, say, feel, and do, then I see the other as the same, a separate, independent entity in control of everything that they think, say, feel, and do. And so with that combination of beliefs, when life unfolds as it's destined to unfold, what is included in destiny is the reaction of suffering that we're very familiar with. And so what's being put forward here is just a description of how I've come to see the dynamics of life. They're the same descriptions and pointers that Ramesh would put forward. And if we see that if we see the descriptions, we can then come to see that the suffering that arises is not something that I am creating, but it's rather something that's happening that I get to experience. I have to experience. It's part of the experience of being human. And so what is deeply ingrained in the beliefs is that it's very personal, that I am making this happen or the other is making it happen. Because of the way I acted and the way the other acted. And so the descriptions that are put forward here are hopefully showing that what happens in forms of suffering is really a happening and not your doing. And the same principle applies to not only our attitude to life, but also our functioning in life on a biological level. Because life didn't only put in place the ingrained beliefs of who we are, which tend to be inaccurate, as described. Belief that I am solely this physical entity, and the doer of everything that I say, feel, think, and do, and the other is the same. So life didn't only put those beliefs in place, life also put everything else in place. Life essentially formed us from the moment of conception up to this very moment. We have been growing as an organism. We don't dictate how the fetus grows and how the heart develops and the brain develops. At a certain point, the heart gets to a development stage where it starts functioning. And so life has created the human being to be one way in each moment. Essentially, a combination of two factors. The genetic components of the human being and the up-to-date conditioning that life has delivered moment after moment after moment. So in each moment, life is delivering new conditioning. And that new conditioning adds on to all of the new conditioning that has come before. And in each moment, the cumulative amount of new conditioning we can call our up-to-date conditioning. And so our up-to-date conditioning is continually being adjusted by new conditioning. So new conditioning can come in that reinforces the general themes in our up-to-date conditioning, or we can get new conditioning that radically changes our up-to-date conditioning. So what was being pointed at is that psychologically, the suffering that arises is not optional if the beliefs are in place, and life has put the beliefs in place as part of our up-to-date conditioning. So if we suffer, if this understanding starts to sink in, it might be seen that the suffering is a happening and not my doing. And as just described, it's not only the suffering that is a happening and not our doing, but the way we function in each moment is a continuation or an expression of how we are on a biological and psychological basis, in each moment. So in a given circumstance, the human's makeup will dictate the way they respond to the situation. So just like two chemicals that have a specific chemical composition that they didn't decide, when those two chemicals come together, there's a reaction. And the reaction is impersonal. It happens based on their makeup at that point in time and the environment that they find themselves in. And sometimes the reaction is violent, and sometimes the reaction is inert, and anything in between. And human beings are like very complex versions of this, very uniquely shaped in each moment. And we find ourselves in circumstance, and that's life unfolding on the circumstantial level. So the thoughts that might be arising in this moment are part of your biological and psychological makeup. You find yourself in a circumstance, and that circumstance and the makeup of each of us in this moment mix and create a response. And so the thought is actually a response based on our genes and up-to-date conditioning that we have never been in control of. Which means our thoughts, which we get to experience, we have to experience, are involuntary. And once again, we can say, a happening and not my doing. And not just the thoughts, but the feelings, the words, the actions, all based on the body's genes and up-to-date conditioning. And so when we don't understand this, what we're left with is essentially the experience on the surface in each moment. And the experience on the surface in each moment says, I am choosing what to say. I, as a separate, independent entity that has complete volition over what I'm going to say next. In the moment, there is the sense, the feeling that I can move my hand to the right or to the left. It's undeniable that the experience tells us that we are in control of what we say and what we do. And so that's why the deeply ingrained belief of personal doership has been put in place. Because the experience is a certain way, and there's a feedback loop. The experience becomes part of our experience, which we can consider part of the new conditioning in each moment. And that new conditioning forms part of our up-to-date conditioning. And so our up-to-date conditioning includes this ingrained belief that I am a separate independent entity in control of everything I think, say, and do, and the other is the same. Our experience is such that the best we can hope for in life is more pleasure and less pain. This starts to change once we start to look at life below the surface experience. When we start to inquire, guided by certain concepts that are coming from a place of having seen past the surface experience, then our inquiry takes us deeper, and what becomes seen is new conditioning, which has the effect of changing our up-to-date conditioning, sometimes radically. So this notion of non-doership is not something new. This notion of non-doership has been around in the major teachings for thousands of years. Shankara's teaching includes a lot of non-doership in it. The Buddha's teaching, a phrase that Ramesh used to really like to repeat, because he said, after having come to this realization for himself, he came across this phrase in the Buddha's teachings. It says, events happen, deeds are done, consequences happen, but there is no individual doer thereof. And in the Bhagavad Gita, when Lord Krishna is counseling Arjuna, and Arjuna sees that he has to fight the enemy and recognizes that the enemy is made up of his relatives and friends and his mentors and gurus, he says, I can't fight. Maybe I can fight my relatives and friends. Maybe I can kill them. But my gurus and mentors, I can't. And Lord Krishna said, you are a warrior, you must fight. Meaning, as I interpret it, you are designed a particular way. You have to function according to your design. And then the part I think is particularly poetic. As time, I have already killed them, which is implying that the story of life has happened, is a creation, and that all of us in each moment are functioning exactly as we're destined to function, essentially as characters or instruments through which Source is functioning. And so it makes sense to me that for as long as life leaves in place the deeply ingrained belief of personal doership and the accompanying belief that what I am essentially needs more in order to be complete. The guilt, blame and pride, worry and anxiety, expectation and attachment to outcome are forced to continue for as long as life leaves those beliefs in place. It's not an option if we understand the simple mechanics of what's being described here. Life creates an instrument, and then that instrument functions according to its design. It simply can't function differently unless it is designed differently. It's like expecting the washing machine to toast your bread. It's not going to happen. And the toaster simply can't wash your clothes. Great.
One, two, yeah. The state you describe, the state of insight, the understanding of non-doership and the surrender to what is, seems to be, to me, a certain insight, mindset, attitude. And I would like to understand how robust it is. And one attack could be amnesia. So my question would be, let's say in your case, just a hypothetical question, you drink very, very much, or you drive against the wall with a car, or whatever you do, and you lose your memory, and you lose the memory of these so many satsangs, and you point to your left hand and you have your certain sequence how to explain things. So this seems to be knowledge and memory. Mm. And let's say this is erased or at least not accessible anymore because of an accident. Mm-hmm. Would you fall back to the buggy version, which doesn't have so much light? Or would something remain, something survive?
Yeah. It's funny you asked this question, because probably only 10 days ago I had this exact inquiry in myself. I can't remember what the answer was, but it was exactly this. I have an answer based on the previous understanding, but exactly the same scenario came up. So one thing Ramesh used to say, which is not exactly in line with what you're saying, but he said that when the understanding is total, if you want to see, I think he was half joking when he said it, but he said, if you want to see that the understanding is total, submit yourself to a lie detector test. And he had heard that you can get an injection, like a truth serum. And he said, before you do that, you get someone to ask you, do you really believe that you're not the doer? And so he said, if the understanding is total, that under this truth serum, the response you give will be absolutely, I can't see it any other way. I'm not the doer. But he was making a point, because there's some subtleties here, which is how we can answer your question, is that this understanding actually isn't the gaining of new knowledge. What is being delivered here is concepts that essentially act as an antidote to the existing false beliefs. Beliefs that when we investigate life for ourselves turn out to be really strange. We scratch our head and go, how is it that I didn't see this for so long? How come humanity hasn't seen this? Because when we actually look deeply, and the strange thing is, science is now telling us that what's being said here, you've got scientists who have been doing objective research and observation. That's the important part, is science is very good at observing. And I'm not saying that science has an absolute answer, but Ramesh used to be really happy when he'd start seeing science confirming what mystics have known for a long time. And so science is now telling us that the idea of free will, as we imagine it, the definition we have of free will, is just simply a nonsensical notion when we actually see the workings of the human being. But because it hasn't got enough traction yet, people might hear it, might see a documentary on it and go, oh, that's really interesting, yeah, I get it. And then back to normal daily living with the deeply ingrained belief of personal doership. Once that information comes out in a broad enough scale, it's simply, so I can imagine that at some point in the future, society will laugh at the fact that humans believe that they were doers. It just won't be part of the... it's just like we now laugh at the fact that we thought that the earth was flat. Once it's exposed, the old way is seen to be nonsensical. And so what the concepts do is they're antidotes to the false beliefs. And so we don't end up replacing one set of belief with a new set of belief. So this is why I said, when Ramesh said take a truth serum, it implies that we have a belief system. And it's not. It's the dissolving of the old belief, which essentially veiled a clear seeing of life, or a clearer seeing of life. So the veil was this belief in personal doership, and once that's dissolved from the system, the concepts that dissolved it actually can fade away. I just happen to have it in my memory because it seems like for now it's my role to share these concepts. But there's a lot of concepts that were part of my process. going back, earlier on in the process, that I can vaguely articulate anymore. They serve their purpose, they do what they need to do, undo stuff, and then they fall away. And the next thing. So my conclusion is that if memory got wiped, one of the concepts that would be irrelevant. But things like if I forget my name and maybe, all sorts of historic data, I suspect what happens is that the innate structure of what's left, which is what was the understanding was part of the innate structure that is left, not part of the intellect. So the total understanding is not an intellectual understanding. The total understanding is what we can call the process whereby the intellectual understanding, which is what we get when we hear the concepts, and we can say, I heard what you said and I understand it in principle. So you could actually repeat, you could say what you're saying is that the human being in each moment has been designed by life based on its genes and up-to-date conditioning to be one way in each moment. So once you reiterate that to me in a way that's accurate, I go, yeah, you understand it intellectually. And you then say, and I understand that the suffering is based on the human being as they're designed in this moment, including a belief that they actually are the doer, so in the non-recognition of how the human actually is. And that's where the suffering comes from. And I go, yeah, that's exactly it. You understand it intellectually. And then the process is whereby we go out into daily living, doing whatever we need to do, work, family, friends, holidays, and automatically, not as a process, not as a task that you have to, you as a doer, okay, I need to apply myself and do 2 hours a day of this task. You don't have to do anything more. Once you've heard the concept, you just go out into daily living, and if they have become part of your up-to-date conditioning, and so at the point when you can reiterate them, then it means they're part of your up-to-date conditioning, especially if you can reiterate it over a period of time. Then that part of your up-to-date conditioning automatically starts to function without you needing to control it, without you needing to exercise, okay, now I'm going to apply the concepts that I've understood. So you find yourself walking down the street and you stub your toe. And one of the concepts, which we haven't spoken about today, says that the flow of life is either pleasure or pain. And pleasure or pain is either physical pleasure or pain, emotional pleasure or pain, or financial pleasure or pain. So you're walking down the street, you stub your toe, and there's intense pain. And the thought might arise, that's pain in the moment. That thought arising is part of the deepening of the intellectual understanding based on your own experience. So seeing the descriptions, which are what the concepts are, you're seeing the descriptions in your own experience. And at some point, you don't need to keep repeating, this is pain in the moment, this is pleasure in the moment, this is suffering, this is guilt, this is blame. At some point that falls away, but for a while, it starts to happen automatically. And it's actually great. It's a coming to see the landscape of life in a way that maybe we haven't seen before. And all of the concepts put forward here are specifically relevant to happiness and daily living. So when this process starts happening, what you might start to feel is that what's automatically happening is a seeing of the landscape more clearly, or as described by this process. And you might see that this is a coming to understand life more clearly, understand myself more clearly. So it's not a practice, it's something that starts happening. And as the understanding goes deeper and deeper and deeper, which means as the intellectual concepts are ticked off for yourself based on your own observation of your own life experience. They go deeper and they uproot the deeply ingrained false beliefs. Because you've got two belief systems now in the system. And the intellectual understanding going deeper and deeper is actually much more strong than just a belief system, because it's a concept that you've been asked to investigate for yourself, and you start investigating it and you see, yes, that holds true, that holds true. So it's not just a blind belief, it's a confirmation of the concept based on you actually seeing it. And so now there are these two opposing forces: the deeply ingrained beliefs that are based on ignorance and error, and the deepening understanding that is effectively fighting the deeply ingrained beliefs. And what we find starts kicking them out. And what comes out with the beliefs is a whole lot of energy. We can call doership energy, or we could call it the load of guilt and blame from the past that has been locked away in the system. And at the core of that energy is this doership belief, which has become part of our identity. So essentially the understanding goes deeper and deeper and uproots, throws it out, those other beliefs. So, and then they themselves dissolve. So the piece that remains actually ends up being the revelation of the core of the human being. It doesn't end up being an intellectual peace of mind. It turns out to be the peace of mind of our true nature, you could say, or the core of the human being, which is something that has been unrecognized. The core of the human being is the consciousness. So what I've been talking about so far is on a biological and psychological level. So the human being, on a biological and psychological level, is a result of the genes and up-to-date conditioning. But then there's this other factor, consciousness, the sense of existence, which we could say is on another level, not the genes and up-to-date conditioning. It's sort of prior to that. And if we find ourselves resting there, resting in this core that might have presented itself, if because the teachings tend to point at that core as being very substantial, very significant in this process, then we end up finding that our peace of mind is not an intellectual peace of mind. It's not that we find a circumstance and we are justifying the circumstance with our intellect, saying, well, my happiness isn't to be found in outcomes. This is okay because this is just an outcome. It'll be okay. You'll get over it. That wouldn't be peace of mind if that was what was happening continuously. That can be part of the process at the beginning, but actually even in the interim stages, what happens is that the concept comes up, a concept that says, my happiness isn't to be found in outcomes. It comes up because the opposite thinking is happening. The thinking of attachment to outcomes or expectation. And when that's recognized as being suffering arising in the moment, this concept comes up and cuts it off. Says, my happiness isn't to be found in outcomes. Stop. And the stop is where we connect to the core of ourselves. So we remember who we are. And the obsessive thinking about what outcomes we need in order to be complete, and the resistance about what the other person has done to us, that's based on the non-remembering of who we are. And if the thought comes up and says, no, none of that, stop. We drop in, here I am. That's better. What a relief. And we find that this, what a relief is not an intellectual it's not an intellectual movement. It's actually a movement to drop prior to or beyond the intellect. So, long way of supporting the answer that says the loss of memory shouldn't have an effect on the understanding.
May I continue?
Sure.
I think one basis of my question is in this case, how far the ability to rest in consciousness, not only to go there and have this relief, but also to rest there, how much of this ability needs the intellectual insights as a kind of basis. So what you described, for example, you said then the thought pops up. Happiness is not an outcome. I don't depend on outcomes.
Mm-hmm.
And this thought comes from somewhere.
Mm-hmm. The intellect.
It's good that you have it, because this is actually a kind of trigger. Mm-hmm. It's a kind of asset. So your 5 fingers, and then you have 2 additional. I think these are assets, and you have. If you say you are a musician, you can play scales. So you have assets, and you can use them. You can combine them, and they are valuable for you. Mm-hmm. So they are tools, so to say. And my question would be, if these tools fall away, mm-hmm. how independent is the ability to rest in consciousness?
Yeah, so I go back to the same answer, because the description that the thought arises, my happiness simply isn't to be found in outcomes, is a description of the process of the understanding going deeper and deeper. And so as the understanding goes deeper, what will happen is the suffering arises less frequently. And when it arises, it will hang around for less time, so for a shorter duration. The reason that it hangs around for a shorter duration is because the understanding kicks in and cuts it off. So when the understanding is total, the suffering no longer arises, and so therefore the asset that you were talking about, the thought, doesn't actually need to arise. It needs to arise as long as the old beliefs are in the system that are still producing the suffering. And so then the concept arises to cut it off. But when the understanding is total, and the thing is that at some point, and this I can vouch for it, I just simply cannot see life as personal. I still get to experience it as personal. Things are personal to Roger, and then there are other things that are personal to someone else. So the experience is the experience of Roger living life. But the movement of Roger himself, the speaking, the hand moving, it's well and truly been witnessed as a happening, not as an intellectual witnessing, not where the intellect witnesses, but some shift where the awareness of what I'm happy to say Roger's awareness witnesses the functioning of Roger's body. And it doesn't require the concept to do that witnessing. In fact, that witnessing is a primal function of the consciousness. It's an innate functioning of consciousness, and it isn't an intellectual functioning. So when the intellect drops, we're still able to be aware of the situation without intellectualizing it. And if the awareness drops to a point where naturally sees everything as a flow, not as my doing or the other's doing, then that's the non-intellectual understanding, which is, I guess, a flowering of our true nature as the witness to life.
Then I guess my misunderstanding, then I probably see the root, or maybe I see the root of my misunderstanding. What you called, if the understanding is total, is not what other people would call mind. It is something more, right? It's not mind, because I mean, the satsang I have experienced so far, they have this idea of mind, something partially bad, thought processes. And if you say the understanding is total, I would say now, with my understanding of what you say, or what resonates, this understanding is not equal to mind. This understanding, if the understanding is total, it means it includes something beyond thoughts.
Yes.
Because, and because my question was, if it's only understanding, mind, thoughts, and these thoughts are wiped out, what can survive? So something has to be on a level which is beyond thoughts.
Yeah.
And then my question would be, how can we store things there? Store as in storage, like a computer. How can things be stored there? I understand how thoughts can be stored, and there's a lot of research, and this is something which is beautifully shown through scientists now, that we understand these processes much better, and we see how buggy they are. But the storage of the insight, which is beyond thoughts, there is no research as far as I know, and I would like to sense a little bit how the processes are there, because the other processes we somehow know, but the processes how to store things there this is something which is a little bit far away and very interesting, and probably not or maybe not a potential victim of amnesia.
So what's often emphasized in non-duality teachings is that happiness is what we are. We are happiness. Our true nature is such that it is always at peace with life, because it is one with life. And it is only the mind that creates a resistance. So the mind, and when I'm using the word mind here, I'm talking about the thinking mind and a specific type of mentation. So it is only the introduction of the thinking mind that disturbs the very nature that is at the core of the human being, a nature which is not in opposition with life itself, but is inclusive of life itself. And so then that can answer your question, if that's acceptable to someone, it can answer the question, because it says, the very core of what we are has no issue with the flow of life. It's only a particular functioning of the human being, the thinking mind, that has been programmed, has been conditioned to interpret life as an attack on what it is. And so once that has been dissolved, the arising of suffering simply stops. So that's why we say that peace of mind is not the addition. It's not the addition of any new knowledge either. Peace of mind is simply the end of suffering. And if we see that the suffering comes from mind, that amnesia actually may have a benefit, because it might wipe out our belief in doership. If we step away from certain teachings a little bit, I would be very happy to say that what happens is that as we function, so if we look at life as an evolution and see the human as part of an evolution, that as we start to experience life in a way that is more optimal, the whole body system learns from that. And once it's experientially learnt an optimal way of living life, I wouldn't be surprised that you'll find a significant physiological rewiring that happens as part of that relearning, whereby the old way simply is obsolete. The body has actually rewired itself to no longer be able to relate to life the way it used to. And so once again, the amnesia, if it happened, probably wouldn't affect the rewiring that has happened on a much deeper level, let's say. And I'm talking about a neural network rewiring, including.
So many more thoughts, but I don't know. This could go forever, but yeah, I love it, but I don't want to.
Okay.
It's too much talking time.
Just for the sake of the recording, if you can just check the green light is on.
So far what I've understood is you are saying that there's a teaching which probably everyone understands, that you are a mind, you are not mind, and etc., etc. But the living, when it comes to living, people are not able to live it. Especially people in India, they get exposed to all these so-called spiritual concepts very early on in large doses. That you are not body, etc., etc. But when it comes to living, that living doesn't seem to be, those concepts don't seem to be coming into the living. And you are saying that the self-inquiry and you should ask question to your own mind, is this right, and inquire, and that understanding will slowly come into your life. But sometimes you find that there are deep-rooted subconscious sanskaras inside you, and just to give you an example, I know that getting up at 5 o'clock in the morning and going for a run is a very good thing for your body. Does it happen? Actually, your mind knows it perfectly well, that I need to get up and I need to go for a run, and that will be good. But you many times end up sleeping some more time in a cozy bed.
Sure, yeah, I agree.
So, what is that bridge which kind of make a switch from you intellectually understanding and at thought level understanding the things, and then the things coming into a practice? So what is the barrier which really is, and is there any practice which we need to work on to remove this veil of mind, which understands what is good, it understands what needs to be done theoretically, but when it comes to doing it, it doesn't do it?
Yeah, because it means that deeper down, there is a different understanding.
Correct.
So there's an understanding on one level, but deeper down, a different understanding, which is exactly the vasanas and samskaras. And so one of the obstacles is the intensity and the ingrainedness of those vasanas and samskaras. They themselves are the obstacle, and it gets uprooted. One, in general terms, I would say according to destiny, because it isn't our effort that uproots it. What I mean by that is, it isn't the effort that we apply as a separate independent entity that has the capacity to apply its own effort. The effort gets applied as the capacity to apply the effort is there. So everyone is always applying as much effort as they can. And someone will say, no, that's not right, because a year ago I found myself not putting much effort into this teaching, and now I'm putting a lot of effort into this teaching. And I would say, well, actually, the way I see it is that a year ago you weren't capable, based on your genes and up-to-date conditioning. It wasn't a match for you to put any more effort in than you actually did. Your up-to-date conditioning a year ago might have been more interested in training to be a professional soccer player or what have you. And now your genes and up-to-date conditioning have changed such that you find motivation and effort is happening, not your doing. And so if it is a happening that effort got put in now but not a year ago, we really have to say then it's destiny that determines how much effort gets put in. It's destiny that determines how deeply ingrained the vasanas and samskaras are. And it's destiny as to how the effort and the ingrained belief systems react with each other, or what effect the effort has on the ingrained system. Now, so that's one explanation. It can sound disappointing that that's the answer, because it sounds like, well, I'm not in control. This doesn't sound very good. But how that change happens is by life introducing new conditioning that uproots the old conditioning or starts to dissolve the old conditioning. And so at the same time as the mind, the thinking mind, the mind that believes it is the doer, so basically the thinking mind is the mind that tends to react to life out of line with what is, or interpret life inappropriately. At the same time as the thinking mind is saying, this sounds like terrible news, the very fact is that destiny, not you, but destiny has put you into this room today, listening to new conditioning that is not the sort of conditioning that you generally receive in life, the sort of conditioning that is specifically designed to be an antidote to the ingrained vasanas and samskaras. What is at the root of the vasana and the samskara? The belief in personal doership and attachment to outcomes. So there's reason to be optimistic, to see that life is bringing about the change that is required. Life is putting me into a place that is a place where I can expect, or not expect with an expectation, but if I look at it objectively, I can say, well, life might be doing the job. And another description which is useful on another level to your question is as in, what is one of the big shifts that can happen that is effective at uprooting the ingrained beliefs? So remember, I'm not telling someone that this is a shift you need to make. It's just a description of a particular movement that, when it happens, has a big effect on these ingrained beliefs. And that is to start really seeing, really looking at what is pointed at, rather than hearing it and understanding it in the realm of mind. And the mind is designed to function that way. So if I were to say to someone, I'm going to describe something to you, and in 10 minutes, whoever describes it the best wins the prize. So I start saying, there is an apple on the table in the corner of the room, and the apple is round, and it's a red apple. And so someone's listening, they go on, yes, tell me more. And I say, there is an apple on the table in the corner of the room. It's a round apple, it's a red apple, and it has a stalk and 3 leaves. One of the leaves is brown. Yes, okay. But there's an apple on the table in the corner of the room. Take a look. Yes, tell me more. I'm waiting for your description, because in 10 minutes I'm going to describe it back to you. I say, yeah, but there's an apple on the table in the corner of the room. Take a look. Yeah, but can you give me some more information about, which of the 3 leaves is brown? And it can be, just take a look. I'm describing something that is there. Oh, Oh, look, there's an apple on the table in the corner of the room. Let's say there's a table in the corner and no apple. Or the apple is, I don't know, a vase, and it's not really an apple, it's a vase in the shape of an apple. So now that you've looked, you have your own information about what is being pointed at. And for some reason, the mind, when it thinks about things, believes it is knowing the thing itself. And so we can start to believe a lot of concepts, or understand a lot of concepts in our head, thinking we've got it. And so when we get given concepts about, let's say, you are not the body, actually that's not what these teachings are saying. I deviated to answer a question, but the core of it is looking at life on a practical level, in daily living, because it's things that can be verified. If we just get told that everything's God's will, surrender to God's will, where do we get to verify that? We don't. We have to keep mentating it and believing it. So if you say that, let's say, in India, there is a lot of exposure to these concepts, but not a lot of integration of the concepts into daily living, thank you, then it's usually a result of the fact that the concepts are hard to verify, hard to see what is being pointed at. It's not impossible, because the non-dual teachings, which are pointing to something fairly esoteric, are actually pointing to something that is right here. Awareness and the sense of existence, or when it says what you are is, all there is Brahman. What does that mean? What does Brahman I mean, obviously it means, let's say, God in simple terms. But when we hear the non-dual descriptions, they go into a lot of detail to allow us, if we really look at the present moment, plus an intellectualization, what does that mean? This and that can't mean what I'm seeing. How can I see it differently? And if there is a intellectualization, but with the intention of seeing, so it's like looking at this, all of this is Brahman. I am not the body. I am that in which everything arises. I am that in which everything arises. Well, I can't be, if I am that in which everything arises, I can't be this, because the couch doesn't arise inside this. So what am I? I am that which pervades, is all pervasive. Then it says, and you won't find what you are in your mind. So I am that which is all pervasive. And then the thought is, but I won't find it in my mind. And if the mind starts realizing that, maybe it says, but I won't find it in my mind, I am that which, stop. And if it's destiny for someone to really find the motivation to understand, not as scholarly knowledge, but really understand what is being pointed at, then awakenings and shifts can happen that demonstrate, allow us to see what hasn't been seen before. Now, we don't need to approach it from the esoteric level. If we see that certain things are two ends of the one thing. Enlightenment is happiness in daily living. If I come to know happiness in daily living, then I will be enlightened. If I come to awaken and integrate that awakening, then I will have happiness in daily living. So we can play with it from both sides. And so that's why these pointers are there in a sense to say, okay, well, let's point at those things that are readily recognizable to people. And let's put it in a way that gets right down to the crux of the issue. what is enlightenment in practical terms? It's happiness in daily living. What's happiness in daily living? It's peace of mind. What is peace of mind? It's the end of suffering. What is suffering? It's guilt, blame, pride, worry, expectation. What is the basis of that? It's the belief in doership and attachment to outcome. And are those beliefs, doership and attachment to outcome, are they accurate? So this is the next part. And we start to look at the human being. We get given descriptions that the human being essentially has been grown, not separate to life, but part of life. Simultaneous to me growing, everyone else is growing, and the whole movement of life, the whole front of life is moving forward. It's like the expansion of the universe. That what I am in each moment is a result of everything that came before. And if I want to keep it simple, I say what I am on this level of the body, which is the level where the suffering arises. That's the level where the issue is. On the level of the mind, I see that the body is a result of genes and up-to-date conditioning, two factors that no one has ever been in control of. If I really think about this and really start to see it in action for myself, seeing it in action means I see myself function, and I see myself function according to the values that my family instilled in me. Or I judge someone, and I see that I'm judging someone according to things that my school has instilled as being, things that we have to be good at. And this person is not exhibiting those factors. Or I find a reaction inside of fear when I see a dog. And it becomes very apparent that this fear is based on an incident that happened when I was young with a dog. I start to see that everything, I speak English because I was conditioned by life to speak English. If I was conditioned by life to speak German, I wouldn't be able to speak English, I'd have to speak German. And if I can speak both languages, I see it's because, I went to a school that taught both languages. So then I start to see, all of this that I am in this moment is a result of my genes and up-to-date conditioning. But if I just believe it intellectually, even if it makes sense intellectually, and yet it's not confirmed over and over and over again, based on my own looking and things clicking, then the understanding doesn't go deep. And as the understanding goes deep, based on us really seeing what's being pointed at, saying, I have one priority, and that is to see what is being pointed at here. If that, then we can say we're earnest. Earnest to me is both one when we find a complete dedication plus a movement happening. So earnestness is not a personal quality, very good, you're earnest. To me, it's more a description of a certain movement. And when there's earnestness, there tends to be focus, single-pointed focus, and a movement that happens, meaning the understanding starts to go deeper. That's a sign of earnestness. There are, in life, we have people that are very motivated or devoted to this, but the movement doesn't seem to go anywhere. And you could say they're not earnest, but remember, it's not a personal thing. It's not like saying you're not doing a good enough job. It just means that destiny has got the person stuck for a while. And then it would make sense that at some point that turns into earnestness. So I really encourage, really look at what the pointers are saying. So an example is that everything that is put forward, or an illustration, should I say, is a concept. I'll give you the flow of life is always either pleasure or pain, concept. Pleasure is a result of the circumstance you find yourself and your biological preferences, concept. Pain is a result of the circumstance you find yourself and your biological preferences, concept. Suffering is attitudinal and not circumstantial, concept. The happiness turns out to be happiness through peace of mind and not happiness through outcomes, concept. So throughout the talk, there are hundreds of concepts delivered. And so we need to see each of those concepts in action for ourselves, in our own life.
So do you think, since you mentioned that a lot of things are in the body in the form of your genes and up-to-date conditioning, I think the techniques like Vipassana will help in changing some of that conditioning?
Yes, I have no doubt that these things will have an effect. They have to have an effect on your... Anything in life will have an effect on your genes and up-to-date conditioning. So whatever we're doing in each moment is affecting our genes and up-to-date conditioning. So obviously certain activities, because of the content of those activities or the makeup of those activities, is going to have, or not just activities, but you find yourself in certain situations, certain events, they're going to have a more significant impact on your up-to-date conditioning. So coming to satsang, vipassana, and various different practices, because they're so focused on these issues, are likely to be the things that have the biggest effect on this. But if we engage in these things with the expectation that they have this big effect, then that's the doership principle reinforcing itself by saying, I am the one that is going to do what is needed in order for this change to happen. So at the same time, there's this very fine line where we surrender our doership and yet find the movement in that direction still happening. So an example of this is that when we get told to meditate, meditation is very important. You should meditate for 2 hours a day. That might be an instruction that is needed for someone who needs to be given instruction. At some point, after meditating for 2 hours a day for the last 10 years and wanting to become the best meditator and whatever, it might become apparent that someone might say to you, true meditation is where there is no meditator. You can't enter meditation as a practice. It's not meditation if you're doing it as a practice. And someone will say, what do you mean? I've been practicing very hard. And so that's meditation in its infancy, in a sense, when it becomes clear that the meditator is part of the problem. And you find yourself meditating with no expectation, meditating when you feel like meditating, because it feels good. Then the understanding of non-doership, the understanding of surrender has happened, but not because of this doer. The vipassana essentially is powerful. What I think is most important is to see the functioning of the body from a perspective of the witness or witnessing. So I'm not talking about the intellect commenting on the functioning of the body, but the mind quietening down, or doesn't even quite, so the thoughts can still be there and something is aware of the thoughts. Something is aware of the jerk in the body. And even, this would be blasphemy in Vipassana terms. But Ramesh used to say that in a really advanced form of Vipassana, not do you stay completely still and allow the itch to intensify and intensify. In the very extreme form, maybe of not Vipassana, but what Ramesh would say is you would allow the finger to rise and scratch the itch. Recognize it not as you're doing, but as a happening. So that which is in meditation is aware of the non-doership of the scratching of the itch.
So essentially you're saying that you go on doing the things but have a surrender attitude that I'm doing but kind of I'm not doing. and things will happen when they are supposed to happen.
It's how life has always been happening. We just haven't had the attitude that recognizes that. There never has been an individual doer of life. Life has always been a happening, always unfolding at its own pace, according to its own storyline. And the attitude of doership is the attitude that doesn't recognize that. The attitude of non-doership is the collapse of the attitude of doership. It isn't really a new intellectual belief system. It's the collapse of the attitude of doership. And what we find is when the attitude of doership has collapsed, it's exactly as you say. Life, we find ourselves being lived in life. We recognize that as soon as the eyes open, there is consciousness of daily life, including the body, and then an urge might arise to go to the toilet, and the body gets out of bed, being lived by the urge, and then the urge might be to go to the fridge and have a drink, and we find that we are always moving according to circumstance and how that inspires the body to move, or based on impulses that arise in the body that drive the body forward. And so when the belief in personal doership falls away, what you described happens. We realize without me needing to direct life, life continues to happen.
Thank you.
In his question of neural damage, can we simply say that it was destined to be?
I would agree with all of life being destined, yes.
To be. So
Yeah.
that is the simple explanation probably, that it was destined to be. I mean, there are a lot of people in the world who are not getting this understanding.
Mm-hmm.
It destined to be for them. Can we say like that?
Yes, I would say that this is one description, a concept, that life is a creation. We could see it as consciousness at rest, pure creative potentiality before manifestation, and that infinite potentiality at some point has to explode into actualization, and the explosion into actualization is the story of time and space. And so life is always unfolding exactly as it's destined.
I have a question regarding the traditional esoteric teachings, which more emphasize on what you are in your essence, rather than focusing on the forms of suffering. So if you, Nisargadatta's I am that, is continuously bombarded on you that you are that, you are that. So I think probably would one of the reason of that be that the suffering which you mentioned, at the root of it is a conceptual identity, a thought emotion based identity. So when there's blame, there's I who is blaming someone else. If there's guilt, there's a guilty me.
Mm-hmm.
So essentially what those teachings do is, perhaps they say that in the moment that the guilty me arises, that you are reminded that you are actually the sense of I am, and so it is there in the background, and spontaneously it is the false nature of that conceptual identity perhaps is revealed.
Yeah, so you're exact. So because they're two ends of the same dynamic, one is pointing at what you are, and what we're talking about here is pointing at what we're not. With the assumption that, as you said, that what we are is in the background. And so if we jump over what we're not and point at what we are, it's there to be seen. And when that's seen, in theory, what we're not will start to fall away. The other approach is to point at what we're not, to highlight the error in that, to focus on what is veiling that which we are. And if the veil is removed, then no need to describe what we are, because what we are will be there. So what we are doesn't need to be created. And so the esoteric non-dual teachings aren't actually creating what we are, they're pointing at it. And so they're just two different ways. You can remove the veil, or you can point past the veil.
So basically, this teaching doesn't presuppose that an awakening has already happened, because if you say to someone that not say to someone, but if you describe in the sense that attachment to outcomes is suffering, but then for someone whom the awakening hasn't happened, will say, so then what? Mm-hmm. Do they have something else to fall back onto in that case?
Yeah. So we point out that the false beliefs are the belief in personal doership, and give explanations why that belief is actually not as solid a belief as is initially thought based on the experience, the surface experience. And then we say that your happiness is not to be found in outcomes. And yet, even though that's the case, humanity has been seeking outcomes for a long time, believing that happiness is to be found in outcomes. So how do we confirm that your happiness isn't to be found in outcomes? Because it's no point just having a belief that someone tells you. And so we start pointing to our own experience. That's where the understanding goes deep. You say, you have received pleasure in your life plenty of times. Not all the times that you want pleasure have you received it, but many times when you want pleasure, you've got it. And when you've got it, you know that pleasure, often a pleasure you thought, this will be my happiness, is at best pleasure, but doesn't deliver ongoing happiness. So we can go to our own experience, of which there is a lot of experience. Each person has a lot of experience of receiving pleasure and finding that within a very short period of time, that pleasure that happened no longer sustains one's happiness. So we can confirm that pleasure is not the source of happiness, based on our own experience. And then a more significant confirmation that my happiness is to be found outside of the flow of life is when we start being pointed in the direction of moving to a place of being, which is a place outside of thinking, where the thinking is seen to be, prior to this actually happening, the investigation shows us that our expectation, the guilt, the blame, all of that suffering thinking is actually erroneous, based on false errors. And if we find ourselves in a situation that is painful, someone has done something we don't like, and we are blaming them, the thought can arise, my happiness isn't to be found in outcomes. And if that cuts off the thinking, if that cuts off the blame, because we've sufficiently recognized the blame to be a story about circumstance, and we've been directed to drop into a place of being. And so in this teaching, the suggestion is that you can open your gaze, allow the whole vista to fit into your field of awareness, allow the center of consciousness to drop down into your chest area, which is actually its home. So you can visualize it being dragged down from usually the center in the head, where it's been dragged up to, and visualize it drifting back down into the chest as though pulled down by gravity. So the combination of the soft open gaze, allowing the complete vista to fit in it, and the dropping of the center of consciousness into the chest or the heart, suddenly can give us a sense of something that previously wasn't touched on. And as that movement out of thinking into being happens more and more regularly, what we might start finding is that there's circumstances where someone has done something that we don't like. The obsessive thinking of blame has happened, and then a thought cuts off the blame and we drop into being. And if we drop here, we remember, this is what I am, experientially, and we find that the story that was running just seconds before stops and is seen to be a story. And what's revealed is my completeness, my peace, even in the face of a circumstance that is painful. So then we get experiential evidence that my happiness is not dependent on life being pleasure, 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 pleasure. I find myself able to be at peace even when the other has hurt me. So we now start to confirm from our own experience that pleasure doesn't give me happiness, and pain isn't an obstruction to my happiness, from my own experience. And so the more that that becomes known for ourselves, the more the belief in, or the attachment to outcome is seen to be false. And so at some point after that's really been seen to be false, if something happens and we find ourselves lost in this thinking about what the other person has done to me and feeling uncomfortable, we may not find ourselves able to drop into being, because essentially that's not really something we control. It happens, and sometimes the suffering doesn't allow us to drop out of the suffering. At least if the suffering carries on, we might find that a thought arises that says, this is really amazing. I know from my own experience that circumstance is not a determining factor of my completeness. And yet, here I am with circumstance happening that is, not in line with my preference. And yet, the thinking which is clearly based on an attachment to outcome is still happening, even with my deep understanding from my own experience that my happiness isn't to be found in circumstance. And so if that understanding happens at the same time as suffering, it will probably be accompanied by the recognition, this simply isn't my doing. If it was my doing, I would stop it. And so it could become clear that suffering is a happening, not my doing, and the suffering then is allowed to be, knowing that I didn't create it and I'm not the one that gets rid of it. So we it ends up in the same place. What can happen with the, just each teaching has its strengths and it has its weaknesses. If you keep pointing to what we are without addressing all of the dynamics that are problematic, you can create an awakening. The seeker can become convinced that all that is needed is an awakening, and that this process has nothing to do with the intellect. I don't need to think about anything, I just need to remain grounded in my essence, and get frustrated for many years because the intellect has essentially been bypassed, pushed to one side, because a methodology of essentially jumping over the mechanism which is the problem, the intellect. But that's not appreciating in a sense that the intellect has its problematic functioning and its functional functioning. So a lot of contemplation is done in the intellect by the functional part of the intellect. So that's why I'm saying that different methodologies have their benefits and their shortcomings. So one of the shortcomings at pointing at what we are is that the deeply ingrained misunderstanding can remain embedded even with a clear seeing of our true nature, because that clear seeing in the moment is direct and it's a knowing, But the implications of that don't always penetrate down to the level of the beliefs. And so you can have an awakening, and yet suffering continues for many years because the intellect hasn't been honed, hasn't been sharpened to actually start looking at the deeply ingrained beliefs. If the two happen together, if you have an awakening and then you see the deeply ingrained beliefs, you have a really powerful combination, because the awakening demonstrates the impersonalness of life, the happening of life, the non-doership, the non-attachment, because from those awakening places it can become very clear that whatever happens to the body is not touching the core of the human being. And so the combination of the two is very powerful.
Hi, Roger.
Hello.
I don't feel like this is going to be like a very awake inquiry, but I feel like these teachings, in a way, think, okay, the very unawake part of me wants to be like, these teachings have ruined my career, which is not true. But I feel I was exposed to these teachings when I was in my early 20s.
Sorry, who's one?
I was exposed to these teachings in my early 20s.
Yep.
I'm in my mid-30s now. So with Gangaji in the United States, so Papaji Ramana. And at the time, I was signed with a major record label, and writing music was very easy and joyful for me. But I had enough suffering in my life that I was very hungry and thirsty for this. And the teachings penetrated incredibly deeply, and at the time, and something began to shift, and then something with the music, everything that I wrote had to be for like a deeper meaning or purpose. It had to be for the awakening of humanity at large. And which isn't a bad thing, but it began to like take some of the joy out of it. And then I felt a need to like, and then of course, as an artist, you also need to like make money because you have to survive. I mean, we all do. At least that's a story that society reflects. Anyway, I feel that the last maybe 10 years of my life, I've been like circling, and I've had a lot of success to the outside world. I've started NGOs and companies and done a lot of environmental work. I mean, on the outside it looks really good and the intention has been pure. But at this point, I feel like I've been in like an internal midlife crisis for a period of years where there's an understanding that lives within me, and yet I actually don't know how to live in the world with it. And when I'm not creating, part of me does feel dead, like, or that I'm not fulfilling some purpose of why this incarnation is here. And yet when I go to create, I feel like I'm doing and I'm pushing. And I hesitated bringing this up in the group because it's very personal. But I do feel like there's a strong desire in this being constantly to, I don't know. I'll just stop there for now.
Well, the idea that we need to perform and that we need to contribute to life is very noble, but it could very well be part of the false idea of who we are. If we can surrender really and understand that if in a particular moment I feel like lying on the couch, and you lie on the couch fully understanding that in that moment God's instruction to you is to lie on the couch. That God isn't going to judge you for lying on the couch. which is completely the opposite of what society is telling us we need to do, and what we're telling ourselves we need to do. Often because of a sense of inadequacy somewhere, that we need to keep proving to ourselves that we are good enough. So if that's what is functioning, and if we keep feeding that, if we keep believing and moving in that direction, it's a bit like what you were saying yesterday, is that if we can understand that we're being driven by something that at the core of it is problematic. If we keep moving in that direction, we're reinforcing what's at the root that's driving it. A belief, let's say, that I need to keep demonstrating to myself that I'm worthy. I need to keep contributing to society, my purpose in life. When we're looking for a purpose in life, it tends to be an indication that deeper down there's a sense of something missing, a sense of inadequacy.
But I feel my deepest desire is actually just to love people. Like that's like, but when I go to create, and I walked away from this music career willingly a while ago. But I feel that I don't have peace around it 10 years later. I feel like I'm missing something very huge in my life. And I've been working again, actually, recently. But when I go to create in that sense, in that way, and I'm sorry if this is really boring to other people, when I go to create in that way, I do always feel like I'm pushing and doing. So there's that. But I do have a deep longing to love people and to like, and that feels slightly different than the pushing and the doing. And I don't believe God is judging me for lying. And I've done a lot of lying down on the sofa in my life. I've had a lot of inertia and stillness. Those are two different things, but I don't know. I just feel a bit like I'm just like this right now. And I have friends who create from a place of total ease. And that's never been me. So that's always made me question my path. If it's not coming from a place of ease, then I don't know. Maybe I can try to articulate this better. I just spoke spontaneously. I'm also not feeling that great today, so I think it just...
It's very hard to see uncomfortableness in life as what is. The very uncomfortableness resists itself. And the doorway to that changing is always the resistance stopping on the outer level first, because the uncomfortableness is in itself, at its root, it has resistance in it. That's the uncomfortableness. And then there tends to be resistance of the uncomfortableness. Like, why am I feeling like this? Why am I going round in circles? And so the attitude always needs to start on the outside and work its way in. And so the attitude on the outside is an acceptance of the uncomfortableness. And an acceptance means not you accepting the uncomfortableness, but a recognition that the uncomfortableness is not your doing. The uncomfortableness is not something you are creating, but rather something that's there. A bit like...
Isn't that a call to action? Like, I also am very triggered by apathy. I'm very triggered by the destruction, environmental destruction that's happening on our planet. I'm very, like, there's, and I think to create things of beauty is like a noble pursuit, you know?
Only
like,
after you're no longer attached to these things. And it's a hard thing to articulate, but activism very often is driven by attachment.
Definitely.
And in a way, it's great that that attachment is there. The animals that are being protected and the environment that's being protected benefits from that attachment being there. But the activists themselves suffers because of the attachment. And I think you'd find very few activists that are activists with no attachment. But if there are, there would be some that understand the outcome is not in my control, and I'm going to put my efforts in, and once I've put my efforts in, I'm not attached to the outcome. I understand that I'm not in control of the outcome. And so if there's an activist that functions like that, they actually don't see the perpetrator as the enemy. They just see themselves playing a role and the other playing a role. And so at some point what we consider noble might actually be recognized as having
compulsion.
Having suffering at its
Yeah.
root.
I really get this, and I grew up in Washington, D.C., and my father's an environmental lawyer, so I mean, I grew up in this like world. My question now is, as a seeker, without a better word, unless, you know, I want to go live in an ashram, how do I live and support myself in a world where money is a necessary resource and where I mean, I just feel like I fit in to a point, but I also can't fit in anymore. And I've struggled with this for so many years. And it's so exhausting to pretend. And yet, and I feel so inarticulate today, but I don't know how to live in this world. And I don't ever really have. And I've uprooted myself from my culture intentionally, but I don't know how, and I realize I'm saying I don't know how to do it, which assumes that I'm doing it. But how does one live when you can't believe what is?
So even though no one is the doer, life unfolds through actions happening through us, through decisions being made by me. It's the understanding is that, well, the decision is happening when it's destined to happen, but still I'm the one that has to function and make the decisions. So this is the paradox of seeing that I'm not the doer and yet I'm the one that makes the decisions. So this question, so if life is completely predetermined, how do I live my life? This was a question Ramesh said, this is a good question to ask. And his answer was, in each moment, do exactly what you think or feel to do, knowing that the outcome is not in your control, without regrets in the past, and without expectation in the future, and without complaints in the present. Actually, I do in each moment exactly what you think you should do, knowing the outcome isn't in your control, and then sit back and watch what happens, right? Without regrets in the past, without expectations in the future or complaints in the present. That's a description of how if that happens, especially the sitting back and watching what happens after you've done what you think you should do, right? That's a description of living happily. The description of in each moment do exactly what you think or feel to do is what everyone in every moment is always doing. We're either thinking or feeling what to do. And there isn't a great answer to the question. There isn't, oh, this is what you should do. You'll do what you're designed to do. So I can't say, in the next moment, do this. You might not be designed to do that.
I just feel my childhood conditioning was making my work really hard in terms of how I perceive myself in the entertainment industry. And then I come across these teachings, which to me are equivalent with truth, and they began to relieve all of these disorders and anxieties. But now I could no longer function in the industry in which I related to. So I've walked away from, and I know this is just externals, these quantifiable versions of success. And I feel like people are really bored by this, and I do feel badly about it, but I'm selfishly going to just keep talking for a second. Like, walking away from a major record label, walking away from my acting manager, and still watching my friends winning Golden Globes, winning Grammy Awards. This may mean nothing here, but where I come from, it means a lot. And even in Mumbai, I have people and producers who are waiting to work with me, and I feel blocked. And I don't know why I feel blocked when I have a desire to be creating. And I feel like I'm just, I guess some part of my sense of self still needs to create something. I don't know, but not doing it doesn't feel right. Doing it, I always feel like I'm pushing. And it somehow triggers my, I don't know. I just feel like a wreck, actually, and completely, consistently confused, and not really sure how to proceed, and unwilling to proceed the way that I currently am. And I've abandoned not only this, but I've abandoned like my NGO in Hollywood. I've abandoned 3 documentary films that I've made, like so much effort, so much creation, and then I always end up walking away like these children that have come into the world that I never stay with. And it just feels perpetually incomplete.
I think that's the sign. Stop going back in the direction you keep getting driven away from. My experience is that when the feeling to not complete something gets so strong that you can't complete it, it means that the decision that drove you to start it wasn't coming from the right place. If you are driven to do something and that drive is coming from an attachment, you're very quickly going to find that there isn't a sustaining energy to see it through. And so from what you've said, I think it's worth really looking at deep down what is motivating what can sometimes feel like a very genuine pursuit. Like, is there something else motivating that, some attachment to an outcome? And if you, by all means, you keep trying to go back to that, what you're saying, you feel blocked from doing at the moment, as if the block is the problem. The block is maybe life's way of saying, don't keep going back to those projects.
I just don't. This life is precious to me. I mean, I know that is a belief in and of itself, but it is limited. And I'm 37 and I'm watching myself get older, which is not a bad thing, but it is happening. And the older I get, the more I'm aware of how quickly it is going and will continue to go. And I know that there can be an awareness without suffering associated to it, but right now I am suffering. And I don't want time to pass where I felt like I lived in a fog of confusion when I could have been engaged in something useful.
I think my suggestion is to surrender to the fog of confusion, because the fact
Trying, but it's been a long time.
Yeah. This idea that to look back and say, I lived in a fog of confusion and I could have done it differently, is that's some attitude based on hindsight. That in each moment we're all doing the best we can. And the idea that a meaningful life is a productive life is just a belief. The purpose of life, as I see it, is to be at peace. And if we think the purpose of life is to produce or to contribute, we have our own purpose. And frankly, the purpose that I've found is to be. I've concluded that that's the purpose, because when I found myself being with no expectation, no idea of how life should look, that's when the seeking stops. And so my conclusion is, if the seeking stops, the purpose is fulfilled. And I found that the seeking stops not when I was outwardly doing something particular.
But I've had these moments, which is why I was able to walk away from a record deal or walk away from jobs. It's because I had such peace with that awareness in the moment that I was able to leave the things that felt like they had great value to me. What's happened is, over time, I've begun to doubt my own experience of that because I'm still suffering. And then I have this tendency to want to go back to what I was doing, and I feel like maybe I've made a mistake.
Try it, go back. I'm quite sure that you'll find the motivation to carry on once you go back will mean another child left on the side. I mean, metaphorically, your projects, because my sense is that life is telling you to sort of the same advice you were giving yesterday applies completely. And the reason you were giving that advice yesterday is because you were speaking from your own experience. And this is just, now what's exhibiting now is you're in a moment of deep suffering, let's say, or suffering. And what tends to be the case in suffering is it makes life look like it will always be like this, and it always was like this. Yeah. That's what suffering means. And it means that our clarity goes, and the possibility is that tomorrow morning, or even later on this afternoon, you feel completely different. And none of what you're describing seems at all relevant from your own clarity. So it makes sense that you lose clarity in these moments. You can't trust yourself. That all makes sense. That's what suffering tends to do. It tends to create this uncomfortableness that floods the system. And the great news is that it comes and goes. And so the understanding and clarity that has built up over the years, when this shifts, will be there. It hasn't been lost.
Okay, and Roger, you don't have to answer this now, but maybe you can incorporate it in the future satsang, if you're willing, or you feel called. The one thing in my life that I've never abandoned is a relationship. And when I'm in a relationship, it's my whole, it has everything. And then the grief that hits when this ends because of the attachment, an insecure attachment, which blah, 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 comes from childhood stuff, is like consuming. And so there's also this recurring feeling of grief or a broken heart from this. And I would love, if not necessarily right now, but if you're willing to touch on this, because that's the one thing, almost like this like bhakti kind of love that I've never walked away from, and that feels really like a part of, like there's something, but there's a brokenheartedness that seems to live in the side of this being that I can't, a longing.
Mm-hmm. It's probably interconnected, because my suspicion is that the drive to go back to producing things, to contributing things, comes from this need to
manage the broken heart.
Well, no, more a need to prove to yourself that you have a purpose, and in a relationship, being with someone tends to demonstrate to us that, I have a purpose, and if that then shifts, if that changes, it demonstrates the opposite. It doesn't actually, in truth, these things, being in a relationship, isn't proof of our value. And when a relationship ends, it's not proof of our lack of value. But if there is this underlying sense that I need to keep proving my value by contributing in life, then that means that there will be a relationship, an attitude that says, when I'm in relationship, I'm validated, and when the relationship ends, it's a sign of my invalidity. On an unconscious level, maybe.
Like intellectually, I know that's not true.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I can see that. But I also think relationship provides a sense of stability. And because I'm like this, like so sensitive and like so in tune and blah, blah, like I think a relationship provides a stability that then actually allows me to function in a way that I haven't been able to do on my own. So that way when the relationship goes, I feel a level of instability. So it's almost just like a relationship allows me to actually just shine, and then when it's gone, I feel like I'm too consumed with trying to just function in the world again. So I feel it's almost like to go into the world of duality. It's like that masculine energy sort of grounds me so that I can be, and then when that's gone, I get sort of more internally chaotic again.
I would also like you to touch on that topic.
Okay, so maybe tomorrow we'll talk about relationships.
None of the men will show up. It'll be an entirely women's satsang.
So
They'll all be gone. Thank you, Roger.
So I think unless someone has a super burning question, if it's someone's last day and there's something that needs to be addressed, then okay.
Today is my last day.
All right.
I just want to thank you. That's it.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah. Very good. Thank you, everyone.